One of the big things that I'm looking forward to from this task force, and really this is all part of the Big South's initiatives already laid out there, is the Election Day initiative from the Big South, where November 3rd is going to be an off day for
Mhm.
student athletes and for coaches. Anyone who's not aware, if you have an off day, cannot have any athletic programs, any practices. You just are going to have this time for student athletes, for coaches, for everyone involved to be able to go and vote. So we talk about a little bit about having voices being heard.
Mhm.
Do you think this is one of the bigger things in the early days already that the Big South has kind of rolled out that really falls in line with holding everyone accountable, making sure that voices are heard, and getting to that equitable outcome?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think civic engagement and civic participation can go part and parcel with trying to achieve an equitable outcome. And that, I think, is what we have. Recognizing that I think the franchise and voting, right, are really just they're extensions of voice, right? And I always think of like a vote as a voice, if you think of it that way. So being, I think, not only supporters and advocates, but encouraging, I think, folks to exercise their voices, right? For every election, quite frankly, is always something that, as institutions of higher ed, we want to promote. At Upstate, we happen to have like three core values of wellness, equity, and civility. And as part of civility is civic engagement and civic participation. So the ways in which we interact with each other and we treat each other, quite frankly, oftentimes can be seen in how we vote, right? In choosing to vote, in choosing to engage and quite frankly, I think one of the most hallowed democratic systems in the world, right? That's what we want to do. So we always want to be, I think, in a position to ensure that we are not only supporting but advocating for students to develop, I think, their voices in that way.
And sticking in with the community engagement, the civic engagement, and the community engagement, how much should we see, or do you expect to see, the communities around our universities factoring into the decisions that will be made from the task force, whether it's from a decision made at a council level, or if it's just having community leaders coming into the room or just saying, hey, this is what we think? How much of that will factor into the actions that you take on the task force?
I think quite a bit. I think you can always invite voice, right? And I think you should. One of the ways you invite voice and engage the community is to, quite frankly, invite folks, just to take part. Whether that be open discussions that we have broadly, across different institutions, or if we have forums like this, where we invite community members in, I think, to have conversations about perhaps their own, I think, perspective on issues of the day. I think that's a way in which moving forward we can absolutely incorporate into how the task force works. Um, Sometimes institutions will feel as if we are almost in a bubble, right? And sometimes being in that bubble, there's our way, or there's a Campbell way, or there's a Longwood way, and all. And what happens is that I think that's good in the sense that it does help folks inside the bubble develop kind of a unique identity, but it can be to our detriment when we sometimes don't incorporate, I think, the spaces that those bubbles inhabit. One of the cool things about USC Upstate that I really enjoy is that we have a really interesting and cool relationship with the upstate of South Carolina, which is great. And in particular, like Spartanburg and Greenville in South Carolina, we have so many of our students who are not only, I think, invested in our campuses, but they're invested in the communities in which they sit. So whether it be service hours, whether it be civic engagement projects, whether it be simply just inviting community members on campus, we have kind of a nice thoroughfare, which is a good model, I think, maybe for other universities to take of inviting ideas and hopefully, giving some ideas ourselves back into the community. But I do think that it's a critical piece of understanding the conversation about moving forward on race. Because our communities, I think, are what sometimes have informed, I think, the activism that maybe has taken place on a lot of our campuses. And it's been great to see a great blend, I think, of not only our community activists, but some of our campus activists as well, coming together and doing some really great work to try to advance the ball.
Now, speaking of different decisions that will be made in these communities around our schools, one that I actually asked you about last week, Asheville, they've made a decision at the council level to invest in Black home ownership and business ventures as a part of what they're calling their reparations.
Sure.
So, I mean, I'm sure we can get into a number of things about what Asheville is doing, but just specifically from what a city or a town might have as their decision, how do you see this? And it's kind of on the same notes of the last question, but how do you see this factoring into what decisions are made from the task force? Is it something along the lines of Asheville has made this decision? Okay, we can kind of incorporate that, or well, these two cities made this decision, we can kind of incorporate that, because you certainly have the task of looking over the entire Big South. So, how do what these different locales do affect what you look at and how you evaluate? Are you going to be looking at it from more of a case by case thing, or is it just an overall, well, we're thinking about what's best for kind of everyone around the Big South?
Well, absolutely. I think you want to consider, whatever actions are taken, we want to consider actions that are in the best interest of every member of the Big South. Now, that being said, it goes back to kind of our brief discussion of equity and equality. The sense of sameness, so to speak, for any one or any two, I should say, of our universities is really not there. We're all distinct. We're all unique. We all have our own unique identities and communities in which we sit. So, for students right now at Asheville, in the Asheville community, undoubtedly having the conversation about reparations that are happening, at least the proposal to have reparations, right, in Asheville, I think is really it's a fantastic moment. Now, that being said, it's quite possible that even here, like in Spartanburg or in Greenville, like our communities may be having those conversations, but they may not be in the same place, let's say, that Asheville is. But that being said, to me, I think the idea is to move equitably in those conversations. So I think, listen with respect, right, and empathy to someone from Asheville when we think about decisions that perhaps the university may take because it sits in Asheville versus, let's say, my university, which sits in Spartanburg or in Greenville. It's really important, I think, to be considerate of where those communities are on their kind of progression in talking about racial reconciliation or talking about reparations or talking about how we can move forward on race. I do think we'll speak with a unified voice when it comes to delivering an equitable outcome. But I recognize fully that all of our member institutions are in different spaces and they're informed by their communities and sometimes instructed by them as well. So yeah, I mean, for me, I think I love the fact that we have so many distinct universities, but I also like the tie that binds, that is delivering on equitable outcomes across the board.
Well, one thing that always comes up whenever conversations of race and equity come up is backlash,
Mhm.
especially for student athletes, athletes, coaches. It's a lightning rod. You'll hear the stick to sports banter. But when it comes to challenging people, but including them in the conversation, how can you really get that done? Engage someone who doesn't want to be a part of the conversation, yet they're still a part of an organization, a town, whatever it may be. How we go about getting people who really don't want to listen to listen?
It's a great question. One of the things I think it's critical is to recognize that all of this is in an effort, I think, to persuade. We sometimes will persuade with fact, we may persuade with a story or a data point, but you do run across some folks who, quite frankly, are just not in a position to listen to what it is you have to say. We want to be respectful, right? And I think we want to recognize that we can't be deterred by folks who maybe don't agree with what collectively we've seen as being our goal. But we do want to be respectful in those folks who say that maybe they're just not ready. Part of being a trial lawyer, quite frankly, is, it's adversarial in its nature. So recognizing fully that there could be folks who argue against, if not even, the work of the task force, maybe even the existence of one. Is certainly part and parcel of, I think, what all of us maybe figured out might be something that happens. But, we remain undeterred. we remain committed, I think, to delivering on equitable outcomes because all of us want to deliver on a promise of a world-class education, and you just cannot do that. You cannot do that if you're not committed to an equitable outcome. So I would say you, just like I would, tell my little brother or sister, it's like, sometimes you get folks yelling at you, sometimes you get folks who are just, loud and clapping and doing what they want to do. But you always have to like move with a sense of calmness. You have to move with a sense of peace, but you also have to move with a sense of purpose. So long as we stay committed to our purpose of delivering an equitable outcome, I think we will remain committed to the work of this diversity task force.
So this next question, I'm not going to be able to really ask it for the task force. Obviously, you guys still early days, but we've seen with professional sports, leagues like the English Premier League, you'll see kneeling prior to kickoff. Players in the NBA, WNBA, NHL, MLB, MLS, NWSL, virtually every professional sports league. We've seen people voicing their protest before games or going to marches. For your perspective, when it comes to student athletes, when it comes to coaches, whatever it may be, whether it's before a game or just being out in the community, where do you, Al, think student athletes who participate in these levels of using their voice, how do we kind of go about it in a way where everyone's on the same page, going for the same goal, rather than what we've seen in the past where sometimes the message can get lost because person X doesn't like how person Y goes about using their voice?
Sure, that's a great question and a very real situation. I think it's a combination of within the team environment. Oftentimes, you'll see teams move towards supporting each other. I remember participating in a few players-only meetings, so to speak, where if we had an issue on a team, we had to kind of, I'll just say, work it out, right? And we didn't do it in a violent way, but we did it in a way that felt as if it was an honest conversation where truth could be told, but we walked out of that room, that locker room, that particular example I'm thinking of, together. And we walked out together with a sense of common purpose. I often say that it's like it does take a certain sense, I think, to really embrace your role as a student athlete. It does take a certain sense of purpose and commitment, not just to being an athlete, but really to being a good teammate. And in understanding how to be a good teammate, oftentimes you understand that you may not agree with everything that your particular teammate, right, is saying or doing at a point, but there is a moment where you recognize that the tie has to run a little bit stronger because you're on a team. So I have a saying where we talk about, where there's shared value, there is shared work. And if we all share in the value of supporting each other, or if we share in the value of equity, and even those who may discount some of, let's say, the positions that others take, if we can agree to share that equity is a value, right? To agree to share that all of us must have our unique identities affirmed, then maybe through that shared value, we have the shared work. Now, that shared work may look different for someone during a national anthem. That shared work may look different for someone who maybe chooses not to, let's say, demonstrate in a particular sort of way. Shared work may look different for a coach or an administrator who chooses to see things differently, right? When it comes to how it is that we actually give redress to any grievances that have been, raised. But if we have shared value, there's still commonality in the shared work. There's a commonality there. So we just have to build a shared value. And I think we have to, most of us, I think, become a little unmotivated when we meet conflict because we usually don't want to suffer consequence, right? And it's fair, after earlier in the conversation mentioning that, vulnerability is really our true strength. I encourage all of our student athletes, our coaches, our administrators to recognize that the vulnerability that'll come in that honest conversation and a sense of transparency, not only in like saying and stating how you feel in a moment, but also being supportive of your teammates or your coaches. That is, quite frankly, it's the currency of equity. It is the thing that moves us forward. And I think we have to embrace vulnerability in order to overcome our fear of consequence.
And then when you say the shared value and the shared work, Is that the answer to the question that people who want to be allies are kind of looking for when they say, how can I help? What can I do to help? Is that really what is required to kind of get into that mindset of it's not just your problem, it's also something that I can be a part of. This is something that I have to internalize. Is that the answer to the question?
It really is. The shared value and shared work really, I can think of numerous different examples of how during a football practice that turned into like, multiple 100-yard sprints up and down the field. But that being said, it's like when we think about like the ally who wants to, I think, embrace, I think this moment, one of the things that's important is recognizing the shared work that comes with that. It may be presenting, let's say, yourself hopefully strengthened by your own vulnerability, to be in an uncomfortable situation, right? Understand what it feels like perhaps to be a member of a marginalized group, right? Amongst others. Understand what it might feel like to be in a really contentious situation, but to keep a level head, right? To be guided by those values. Yeah, it is undoubtedly shared value and shared work when it comes to allyship. And also, so something I had mentioned earlier, being mindful that we don't always want to continue to go to the well of those who are, let's say, oppressed or struggled or, victimized to somehow insist that they keep telling a story or insist that they somehow shoulder responsibility alone. One of the things that's been great to see, I think, in our most recent protest is that we've had this great plethora of so many different folks from different backgrounds really supporting the efforts, I think, to really lift up Black voices and to lift up the notion that things like Black Lives Matter really affects all of us. And that's been a really interesting, I think, an interesting development. And I say interesting because it's like in my own lifetime, having, when I was in university, we went through the Rodney King riots. You all might remember that or might have heard about that. And that was happening, like, quite frankly, my sophomore year in college. And I remember just how absolutely contentious some of our conversations got when we started talking about race relations, in my own home state of Missouri. And it was interesting, it was an interesting moment. But what got us through that moment, I think, was really this sense that our allies recognized in that space that it's like there was shared value, right? In simply being present, right? There was shared value and not necessarily, feeling as if there was something that needed to be contributed to a conversation, but simply being there to listen, right? And that was a really powerful thing, I think, in my own formation, quite frankly, when I think about what's important. And I mean, if we live and embody, I think, a purpose kind of driven life, not to borrow that phrase again, but if we live in that kind of common purpose, I think we understand that there's always room for allyship. There's always room, I think, for everyone at the table to talk about something that has not just affected, I think, specifically in this case, Black Americans, but also affected white Americans in a way to where I think many of them are just unaware of really the depth of this particular issue. It's a critical piece of understanding when it comes to allyship to basically really get to know what the problem is.
Well, Al, certainly appreciated your time. One thing I do want to get in before we let you go, the equity and inclusion against some other of these vague terms. When you're setting the goals of equity and inclusion, it hits the mark. It feels very intentional. So, how would you say that your aim for equity and inclusion differ from simply making the statements something along the lines of "we're all in this together" or "unity," which can come across a bit vague? How do equity and inclusion? How do those really for you have more power behind it and have more meaning behind it?
Oh, thank you for asking that. There's so equity for me, when I think about the stated conditions of equity, like making the conditions of fairness, right? The fundamental fairness that should exist in an environment. Equity has to be, I think, it has to be captured through data, right? And it has to be measured. And one of the things that's important about measuring, right, how equitable we are is having the tools to do so. So everything from building an inventory to actually calculating specifically not only what is being done, but how it's being done. So whether it be, you know, a particular, let's say, multicultural fair that takes place on a campus, or quite frankly, the services that are delivered from, let's say, Office of Financial Aid on campus. All of those are data points that we like to take together, and we use it to try to determine if we're actually achieving the equitable outcome we set out to achieve. And quite frankly, one of the things that's important about inclusion is that I always like to say that inclusion is an active thing, right? So whether we're talking about decision making, whether we're talking about, I think, participation, whether we're talking about how we really contribute to delivering the equitable outcome, that's where our expertise comes in. We talk about building inclusive practices. So it's inviting voice from oftentimes voices that maybe were not solicited because of past practice. Um, one of the neatest, I think, I think examples I have of that is in simply not just listening to like our student veterans on campus, but also paying particular attention to how our veterans were really navigating like the admissions process and working with something called like Chapter 31, 34 benefits, right? It was interesting to see that we had just not paid full attention, quite frankly, to some really, really critical pieces of information. Like the paperwork was not moving across campus the way it should have been. But for the fact that we actually at some point surveyed that specific like section of students and found that out, we would have never known. And for so many of those students, many of them of color, there were a lot of students that quite frankly were, satisfied with the services we were delivering, but they just weren't quite where they needed to be. And the way we figured out how to get there was really to ask that question, right? So I feel like as an institution, equity and inclusion become, I think, the much more salient, like data crunching number type things that sometimes people associate, certainly with me. But it really is rooted in trying to gauge, I think, satisfaction and engagement and trying to produce, like I said, an outcome where everyone feels as if they've been touched by this commitment to fundamental fairness. That's really it.
Well, I'll certainly appreciate your time. We'll let you go on this. If there's only one thing that someone who's watched this video can take away from this conversation, what would you say it would be?
Oh, meet this moment. I mean, that's a really important point. I would say it's so critical for us to meet this moment and meet it with equity and inclusion. Um, Certainly, that's more than one thing, But in meeting this moment, I'm inviting, I think, everyone who may watch this to feel prepared. The cool thing about the Big South, honestly, is that we have so many neat universities within the Big South Athletic Conference. What I would love to see is for all of us, I think, to lean into meeting this moment right now. And the way in which we can do that, I think, really is to be transparent, to be accountable, and to really embrace each other's presence. Last thing I'll say is, unfortunately, it's become a catchphrase because I've been doing this so long. But, I always say, generally speaking, when I leave a room, that I was honored by people's presence. And it's interesting that it kind of stuck at Upstate because when we start thinking about being honored by each other's presence, right? It's a step beyond like, hey, glad you showed up, right? It's a step beyond just dapping each other up, but truly being honored by somebody's presence, right? I think demonstrates a bit of humility, but it also demonstrates a bit of engagement. And that's the type of engagement we need right now, I think, to really meet a conversation about race and racial reconciliation. So I'm honored by your presence. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're all here. I'm just enjoying that.
Chief Diversity Officer at USC Upstate, Alfonso Atkins Jr., thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for the insight.
Really appreciate it.